Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Ruby AI podcast. I'm one of your hosts today, Valentino Stoll, joined by Joe.
Hey, everybody. I'm Joe Leo. I'm the other host, and we are both here joined by Avi Flombaum. Welcome, Avi.
Hey, thank you for having me.
And thank you for coming in an equal to this episode flannel shirt. I am wearing mine as well. The denim is looking okay up, but the t-shirt is poking out from the...
I have my Evil Martians fanfare on.
And Evil Martians, and even bringing a competitor t-shirt into this podcast. I don't know how I feel about that. I know I'm not supposed to be representing Def Method while I'm here, but I kind of always am. It's kind of my thing. Well, that's okay. We love Evil Martians, and everybody had Evil Martians on this show. So Avi, welcome. We're curious. I guess I'm curious right at the top. You are the founder of Flatiron School. It had this great run of success that was started in 2012. And now you're a few years removed from it. And I guess the first thing I want to know is, what is it that has said about you and about your career? And what do you want it to say about you and your career at this point?
I'm not sure what I wanted to say or what it says about me, but I will tell you sort of how I ended up starting it. I'd never taken a programming class in my life, and I dropped out of college. And it was very funny to find myself like teaching people how to code and starting a school, because it's the last thing that I think I expected for myself in my career. But in 2012, 2011, New York City was still recovering from the financial crisis, and people were out of jobs and kind of not able to find some of their careers just were downsized tremendously. And my friend started Skillshare and needed someone to teach programming classes. And I just left my first startup and I started teaching them, and people really loved them. And I had this one student that took it super seriously. And, I was offered a job at companies and I turned it down, but I told them that there was this one guy I've been teaching for the last 6 weeks. And, he's obviously not a staff level engineer, but he's going to be a great junior and you should interview him. And they interviewed him. And 4 weeks later, I get an email from him that he got the job and he's making twice as much money. And he's got this whole career he sees in front of him and can support his family in ways he never could imagine. And I changed his life. And I'm sitting there looking at this email and I'm like, this is insane. One of the reasons I loved programming and got into startups was because I wanted to make a dent in the universe. I wanted to create some sort of value and meaning. And I never expected it to be through teaching. I always thought it was going to be through building stuff and starting companies. But it seems like I could change people's lives teaching people how to code. And I got really into it. I started learning a lot about how to teach and pedagogy and mentoring students and getting them jobs one at a time for around 6-7 months. And one of the people that took my class was a venture capitalist. And after the class, he emailed me and was like, let's get coffee. And he was like, why are you doing this? You could be the CTO of a company. And I told him that story. He was like, let's just start a school that just does that just gets people jobs. And I didn't know if it was going to work. I thought it was an interesting thing to try. And I met Sharif from Dev Bootcamp that weekend. He was thinking about starting that. And we both sort of came up with this format of what the bootcamps ended up looking like. And I just ran with it. And, there was so much skepticism. When I was telling people that I was going to teach people how to code in 12 weeks, I have a pretty good network in New York. I run NYC on Rails, which is one of the largest Rails meetups. And, everyone I was talking to was like, I'm never going to hire someone that's only been coding for 12 weeks. And I just thought they would. I saw what you could learn in 12 weeks and why not try it? And it worked. It took me a month to get the first 20 students jobs, and the second cohort, the same thing. And then as these people were performing really well, it became a thing. And it just grew and grew. And I really loved it. It's an amazing feeling to watch people learn and change their lives. And that's sort of how it snowballed. I'm proud of it. It's the best thing I ever did in my life. I hope I get to do something that's impactful. And yeah, there's over 10,000 grads that have gotten jobs. It's not, a small amount.
Yeah. And some Def Method current and alumni came from Flatiron School, we're proud to say. Yeah.
So yeah, I think the skepticism, getting over that was really interesting. It took really 2 years for this to become accepted. And then probably around 4 or 5 years in, there was such a proliferation of boot camps of varying quality that the boot camp grad sort of got tarnished. But luckily, we had really established ourselves as like at least one of the tops. So it wasn't that bad for us. And we were also never like scaling. There were boot camps that were enrolling thousands of people doing essentially MOOCs. And we still had like a very high bar for admissions. So, we never wanted to enroll someone that we didn't think could learn it in this time frame, in this format. So yeah, after like, I guess 8 years, I left. It was COVID. It'd been a good run, and I just needed a break. That's been my career. And I've gotten out of education now for a variety of reasons. It's a hard industry. And then also the market has very much changed. But it's interesting. There was like 6 months ago, I was really thinking about this question of what would a modern boot camp in the AI world look like, right? And one of the things you hear is that there are no careers for juniors. No one is hiring entry-level devs because they're going to be as good as the most modern models. If I can get a model to do it, why should I get a junior? I think that's such a funny thing to say because these words like junior, staff level, senior, they're measurements, they're arbitrary, right? So I think what it takes today to be an entry-level developer is a way higher bar than it was 6 years ago before AI, right? I think you have to know a lot more to qualify for being an entry. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that we have to define like, what would someone hire if the person had no experience, right?
You bring up something interesting there with the bar for whatever we decide collectively, but sort of arbitrarily as junior. What does that really mean? Now, speaking as somebody who just hired a junior developer a month ago, I also think it's ridiculous to say that, well, nobody's going to hire juniors. My personal thought, I'd like to get your opinion on this, is that the junior engineers, whether they be young people out of college or people that are making career change, actually have the most incentive to plunge into AI and use it to inform their development and leverage it in their development because they are just learning and because they have no ego to get over. They have no habits to unlearn, right? And so to me, that feels like an advantage. And of course, this is a very small cohort here at Def Method, but it seems to have been proven out. And I'm curious to know what that looks like from your perspective. And as somebody who is, you're writing about this and you are also thinking about what an AI curriculum, for lack of a better word, would actually look like.
So I guess the first thing that I think about is the workflow. Having a really nailed down AI workflow is non-trivial. I think about Kirian at Every, and his AI workflow is just so beyond mine. And I invest a lot of time into how I'm going to use AI and how I'm going to leverage it. Like, how do I get it to not write slop? And how do I create, a review process and a testing process that's efficient? So if I was starting out in code and looking to break into it, the first thing I would really think about is not necessarily the depth of my programming knowledge, but rather my workflow. Because if I can demonstrate that I can very much leverage these tools and at least not get slop at my level, I think that's a competitive advantage. I think of AI as really a force multiplier. So if you're like a 10x engineer, AI is going to improve your efficiency, let's say by 50x. So whatever level engineer you are, it's going to be that level times 50. So first, if you're a 0 level engineer, you just don't know how to code at all, you're just totally vibing it, I don't think you're getting a lot of gain from AI. So if I was at least a 2 or a 3, I think you're actually, as long as you're really leveraging AI correctly, you're still getting that force multiplier, which is going to make you look better than devs that aren't leveraging AI. And on the last team I managed, there were 6 devs, and 2 of them just refused to really invest in an AI workflow. They were still using cursor on like spot line edits and then writing a lot of code. I refuse to write code by hand. I don't care how trivial it is, I'm prompting it. So I think there's a large cohort of devs that, are stuck in their old ways. And I think that unfortunately, they're going to go the way of the dinosaur. Like I think about the devs I knew that refused to embrace the web as a platform, just refused to think that writing web apps was a real thing of their caliber. And they stuck to, the compiled Java desktop apps. Those guys are done. They're just out. So I do think there's going to be a cohort of like really senior experienced devs that just won't embrace this workflow. It's just too much for them to adapt. So I do think if you're trying to break into this, you can't be one-shotting stuff. Your prompts cannot be these vague end-to-end descriptions of what you want. You got to have a sense of what good code looks like and have read a lot of code and be able to prompt in very specific ways. Like, I want a class that does this, that works like that, right? That has these associations. As opposed to saying, build me a login system, I would say something like, create a user class, right? Or use the Rails authentication generator. Things like that, I think, are really important. And then also just did I have the AI write tests? Did I make the pull request small enough so that it could actually be reviewed? Am I writing granular commits? I think those are really important things. I think any code you generate needs to be read. You need to know the depth of code, even if you're not writing it by hand. And again, one way I learned and what I love doing is reading code. I love reading 37 Signals, like open source write book. And I had bought Campfire. I never intended to use those as apps. I just wanted to know what those guys' code looked like. And it's insane. I could never write that code. Like, I just don't think on that level of abstraction, and I don't hold myself to that kind of standard. But it was incredible to read. So I think if I was starting out, like, I would still want to know how this stuff works in detail. I would not cheat myself and rob myself of that learning, but I would very much focus on my workflow and being willing to drop down that level of abstraction. I think that's my biggest fear about how the world is changing, is that people that want to be in code or in product and whatever you want to call it just aren't going to get that they still need to learn this stuff. They don't need to learn it all up front, but they need to learn it. You need to get to a really deep understanding of how these things work. Otherwise, you won't know what to ask for.
Valentino, penny for your thoughts. Are you writing any code right now these days, or are you just prompting?
I am writing code, but maybe 10 to 20%, depending on the day. Most of it is like referential, where I have, like Avi mentions, code that I like for specific purposes. If it's a singleton class or a service object or some kind of form encapsulation or all these things that web developers use day to day, I have reference points and I could say, oh, I'll, generate a thing like this, but for something from some other purpose. Because I do have that depth of knowledge, I also use it for a different purpose, and that's more like architectural, where I want to think about the abstractions only. And I am worried about the long-term growth of a specific kind of class and how it acts with other classes and how that actually works within a system. And so there is like a large variety of ways to use AI. I would hire a developer that doesn't know the depth, but knows how to use the AI tools over somebody who has the depth and doesn't use AI tools, is what it's come to. When I was learning Rails, I learned Ruby through Rails, like many, I think, do. And then later on, you learn, like if you create a Ruby only class, you can work with the system much better and cleaner, right, than otherwise. And you kind of learn that over time. And so I'm curious, like, where do you see that parallel growing? If somebody's new to Rails and they just like jump into an AI coding agent, where do you see the focal points? Where do people try and learn while they are getting these examples generated?
Yeah, I started with Rails, and it took me a while to know where Rails ended and Ruby began. Like, I remember when I realized that like has many, basically essentially a macro, and how like meta programming worked. The one way we taught at Flatiron that I thought was really effective was we always moved up levels of abstraction. So we didn't get into Rails until like week 4. The first thing I taught them was basically object-oriented Ruby, like how to build classes. And, we would build like a class, like a post, and they would build like a command line blog. It had no memory. You boot up the program, you write a post, you close the program, and, the next time you boot it up, there was no old posts. Everything was being stored in memory, at the runtime. And then we took those classes and we added SQL to them. And then they learned create table, insert, right? Like a post class now that when you call save, instead of popping it into like a class variable, it was writing it to the database, calling insert. And then we meta programmed another class like author. And I showed them that, okay, they're writing the exact same SQL, like insert into posts is exactly like insert into authors. How do we abstract that? And that's how we learned like modules, right? So you can mix something in. And basically, they were building a little version of Active Record. Perfect. With the exact same API. They had no idea. And then we moved into, like, we spent like maybe half a day on Rack just so they could see that, building like a basic web server and integrating it with those Active Record like classes. And then we moved into Sinatra, and I had sort of hacked together a somewhat Rails looking MVC sort of structure to Sinatra apps. So they would understand MVC outside of the entirely packaged version of it in Rails. And then we'd finally go into Rails, so that by the time they got to Rails, they knew so much about the API. And suddenly all of that was just abstracted away by the framework, but they understood that, right? And they were never intimidated by like Ruby or like making poros. And I think that's what really helped us get to that depth of really understanding. So what I would tell juniors, or I hate that word, what I would tell entry-level devs is that one, they should be asking the AI whys. Why does that work? How does that work? In fact, fire up 2 sessions of Claude. Have one writing the code and have the other one where while it's writing, all you're doing is asking it questions about other code it's already written so that you can be learning and understanding it. I always like to ask it for pros and cons. When I'm approaching like an architectural decision, I might have an opinion and I'll say, what do you think about this? Feel free to disagree. List out the pros and cons. What other patterns might apply? One, because those choices matter to me, especially complex systems. Like I'm going to need to maintain them. But I also want to understand, like I still learn from the AI on that level. So I would make sure to be doing that. I would ask a lot about why and how does that work? And in that, I would learn. I would also, again, like read code. I would still read the books. I love reading books, blog articles. Like I would always tell our, students, like they need to have a favorite blog. Tell me who your favorite programmer is. I made them all blog. They had to write posts. I would tell all entry-level developers to be writing at least a blog post a week. What did they learn this week? I just think that all those practices still matter, and it's a discipline. We always had script kiddies, and you could always tell. Even at Rails, right? You always could tell the people that had no idea how this stuff was working and no interest in that. You can't have that. You have to love the craft, and that needs to come out. If I was building a curriculum today to try to get people entry-level jobs, I would really focus on the workflow, how to learn, and patterns.
Let's get into that. Let's imagine that you've got a 6-week curriculum, right? And it's the same folks. And let's just assume that this is still a marketable enterprise. Let's say you've got the same 20 people, right, that you had in your first cohort. And your goal at the end of that 6 weeks was to be able to go with a clean conscience to some companies and say, hey, I think these folks are ready to rock. What would you do? How would you structure it?
The way I thought about it was basically, I would want them starting AI workflow first, right? I wouldn't make them really write a lot of code by hand, but what I would want them to do and what I would stop them from doing is they're not using the AI workflow to generate real code yet. They're using it to learn. So they're asking it to, and I would tell them like, you want to build a class that does this. The only prompts I would allow them to use, I would basically build a chat app, like a tutor, that the only things it would answer is basically, here's what I would do, and here's how it works and why. But they would have to hand copy that code into the file so that like they're somewhat writing it themselves and knowing what maintaining it looks like. It would mean that they're not allowed to just have it generate thousands of lines, not read any of it and continue. Things they would generate would be on a way more granular level. Still would be methods, classes at a time, things like that. And then again, just move up that level of abstraction and slowly, allow them to use the AI to actually generate that command line blog app. But the way they would have to approach it was first create a post class, create the CLI that initializes a post or asks me what the title is going to be and calls that method correctly. It would be on a way more granular level. That is basically what I'd go for. They can't just be an engineer. they have to be a product engineer. They have to understand like UI, some design, like they just need to be at that product level. They have to understand like how to write a spec, how to take requirements, how to describe those to the AI. I wouldn't hire just a programmer at this point. I would want to know that they can like really be end to end.
And how would you be able to tell the difference?
Basically, did they write a spec to a product level spec before they wrote the code spec? So like when I'm building a feature, the first thing I start with is basically like what I would write as a product manager. And then I have it create a plan of how I would implement that. And then I read that markdown file for what its implementation looks like. I review it. I decide if I like that architecture, and I basically edit. The process is, the product manager writes the product spec, the engineering manager and engineering team that's going to work on it breaks it down into, sprints and issues, right, that are engineering centric. Same exact process. They have to do.
But for our listeners, what distinguishes that product spec from just an engineering plan, right? A plan of attack that does not take into account the product.
It's what to build and not just how to build it.
Okay.
What is the feature that's going to deliver this value and solve the problem for the end user and the business goal? And then how am I going to implement it? Like if you ask an engineer to build a user registration system, they might build that feature that generates weird usernames, like the way GitHub does, and then also build like, it can't use bad words, so I have to build like a whitelist or blacklist dictionary. That is not needed. Engineers will yak shave features a ton, and that's not their fault, right? They just don't think in terms of like, what is the real value and what's the feature that's going to solve this? Their UIs and UXs are just pretty random. So that's sort of the difference, right? I think there's a big difference in knowing what to build and then how to build it.
This reminds me a lot of like what was formerly behavior-driven development, right? With Cucumber and everything. Like so much of this kind of thinking reminds me of that time where people literally just used Gherkin, which was like very English looking thing that just said, hey, go to this page and then click on this button and then type this thing. And it was almost like behavioral instructions of what was wanted to be built. And then eventually people just hooked it up to like an automation suite and like had something visit a page and click on a button and all of these things that you like, right? And so I'm wondering if there's some corollary here of like, even like junior developers learning. Should people learning early in their career think about that behavioral first? Or should they focus on the structural, getting the foundational depth of programming? Where should that entry point be? Because I'm kind of like confused myself telling people, everybody keeps saying communication is key, it's king, like how you communicate with these AI things is most important. And with that, it seems to me like clearly defining a specification seems more important. What do you think about that?
I think back to like the authors of like the Agile Manifesto and the Mythical Man Month. And there was a time, I think, before, let's say, the product manager was born, where the engineers would have to take specs. You'd be talking to the client, the customer, about what is the problem, right? What's the solution? You had to take, scope the spec. Otherwise, you're in a land war of Asia. And they were very much thinking about, how do we build complex software? How do we really understand what the client needs? And we codify that in the test suite to begin with. I don't know when the product skill came out, when we said that, okay, we need actually specialists on that, like, what are the requirements and what's the solution that can pass it off to the engineers, because it is its own skill. And I guess also some engineers are simply just bad at it.
So are some product managers.
Right, exactly, right? Yeah, I just think like as a product person, I know a lot of engineers that sort of look down at that role. They just don't get why it's useful. Like they just take for granted that the spec they see in front of them, the product spec, was like, of course I could come up with that.
To go back to the conversation we were having earlier about the different layers of abstraction, I do think that the engineering work it takes to solve an engineering problem is a layer of abstraction above or below, however you want to look at it, the software as a whole and how it solves a business problem, right? How it makes money for most of these software programs. And I do think just as somebody who runs a business, who is or was an engineer, however you want to look at me, it is actually hard to plunge down into how I'm going to solve this problem and pick my head up and say, oh, right, it's not just about solving this problem, which is a really cool problem to solve. It's also how solving that problem is going to make the company money. I think it's true exactly what you said. Some engineers don't want to think in such crass terms, right? But that's what we've got. That's why we get paid. And I think it is also the case that some product managers, or just people who call themselves product people, they tend to focus on either the communication between various teams or in just writing the perfect spec. And they also do not connect it to, oh, right, there's somebody that's paying us to do this. And that money comes from whether or not this thing is successful. And I think that mindset, you've nailed it to say that it's a skill. I don't know when it became separate from the engineers, but I actually think it's okay that it has. I don't think it's easy to marry those two.
It definitely isn't. I mean, I've worked with amazing engineers that I would never want them to think about the product level. It's really important that they are working with the product manager, the engineering manager, and so that they just need to think about the implementation and how. You know, one of the things I would see a lot is product people don't necessarily know what's hard and like where the dragons in the code is. And, you know, they might write a fantastical product spec. This is what I wanted to do. And, you know, you pass it off to engineers and they're just like, yo, this is going to take like years, right? Sometimes they don't push back and they just start trying to implement that and it goes haywired. There needs to be a really deep collaboration between product and engineering. My departments are always product and engineering. I never had two separate teams. It was one team because I just don't understand how you can have this silos where like one is throwing something over the wall, waiting for the other one to throw it back.
Yeah, I hear you.
So when the product person would write the spec, the next thing that would happen is they would sit with the engineering manager and the engineers so that the engineers could be like, hey, this part is going to be really difficult. So the product person could scope and say, oh, I didn't know that. Let's try to think of a different solution, right? Let's create what would be easy. That collaboration is so important. And I think it also gives everyone buy-in and understanding what's going on. You know, there's a subtlety to that, right? And again, I don't think that's how it works everywhere, but I do think that's really important to success. Product people just don't appreciate what's hard. And if they knew it, they would make different choices. You have to give them the opportunity to make that choice.
Okay, so then how do we tie this back to AI? Because AI is also not good at figuring out what's going to make you money. Maybe it's getting better. Maybe the latest models are better at it. But, you know, last time I asked it to make me a bunch of money, it failed. And so I'm just going to assume it's not great at it. But how are we supposed to leverage these tools when it comes to sort of that step before or that planning phase before we go in and write a bunch of code? Because the thing is, now we can write a bunch of code. And that product spec that the product manager from 5 years ago brought to us that would have taken us, you know, a year to build. Well, now it only takes 2 months. So it doesn't feel as bad, which doesn't mean that it's a good thing because probably it's not all needed.
My workflow when I'm starting, let's say at the end of like, what should I be building is I'm creating canned like UI demos. I'm using Claude first to create a little React app of what I want the app to look like. So I can iterate and be like, oh, I don't like that feature. That doesn't really seem like it's going to really help users. Let me see a different version of it. I'll ask Claude, you know, or Codex. I'll say like, create 3 options for this screen. What are 3 ways in which we could help the user see why this VC is a good VC to pitch for their startup? What information could be on that page? And yeah, it's just so quick. Like on one level, when I'm working in my product mode, my specs are no longer words. It is like, hey, look at this demo and look at the prompts I use. Like at the end of it, once I have the demo I like, I have basically the AI write the product spec for me. I have a template of what sections I wanted to fill in, you know, examples of what good and bad look like. It's a slash command at this point. And yeah, that's kind of the way I would approach product at this point also, right? Know how to use AI and know, you know, what Chad CN looks like and like create the canned demo, fill it in with fake data, look at it. You get to do different options. And that gives so much clarity to when I'm looking now at the engineering level, what am I trying to build? So again, that's part of the workflow. Teaching product also is a subtlety, right? But there are books on it and there are blog posts, right? Understanding like what entropy is, what information architecture is, what the difference between user experience and user interface is, understanding how to ask questions, understanding even what like business value means. How do you define KPIs? What is the goal? How are you going to know if it actually worked or not? What is your target? How are you going to iterate on it? That's teachable. We didn't do that at Flatiron in any kind of depth. They had to understand it on some level because they were building their own apps, but I would very much constrain what they're allowed to do. One, you're not allowed to design. You have to be using standard component libraries like Tailwind or whatever. You cannot create new user interface elements. Your apps don't need to look like that. So do not waste time on the design, but you still need to create. Here's what my app does on a high level, right? Like I want to see a flow chart. I want to see descriptions of stuff. Otherwise, I just don't know what you're going to build, and neither do you. But I never made them actually like define KPIs or write the spec. That's what I mean by like the bar has been raised. I'd want to see the AI workflow of like, I love that new feature they built on Twitter or X about how they're dealing with like links. X knew that having a link in a tweet meant that the user was getting bounced off Twitter, which is not something they want. So they punished people for putting links in the first tweet and basically didn't know how to solve that problem. People need to link to stuff. Like that's part of the fun of Twitter, right? And, Nikita, when he joined as, the head of product at X, now when you click on a link, right, you get that like scroll up of the embedded browser. So you're not bounced off the Twitter app. You can still read that page and then minimize it really quickly and go back to the tweet or whatever you call them now. That is freaking brilliant. It is so cleanly implemented. It maintains both their goals of we don't want people bouncing off of X, but we need to allow people to share content that is on the web. Twitter's been around since I don't know how long. No one else thought of that.
Yeah, LinkedIn's been around longer. They haven't figured it out yet.
That
you still get dinged for putting links in your posts. Yeah.
That is an insane. You have to understand the problem in both senses so clearly to understand that solution. And now that solution is there, it seems crazy obvious. At no point, I don't think Nikita think, well, how are they going to implement that? Obviously, that's not like rocket surgery to build it. But that's, I would say, like some of the best product work I've seen recently. But I need to teach them to think at that level, to really dig for what the problem is. I drive people crazy when like a department would come to me with a problem. They would also propose a solution. And I have to get them in a conference room and just ask them, well, why? What are you trying to solve? Just the most pedantic amount of questions because their solution is not right. Off the bat, all the solutions are essentially, I want you to build me a spreadsheet because that's the interface people know, right? You just got to ask questions like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Why? Where's the entropy right now? What's the workflow? And then I can understand, okay, here's ways I would solve it. Here's the magic, right? Here's what's possible with good product design. And then I would write, again, take the spec, talk to the product managers, make sure they understand it, do that meeting with the product manager and the engineering team, kick it off that way. I'd want them to go through that process, right? At some point in the curriculum, I would be that end user and say like, we're building an LMS and the grading process is really slow. I have this spreadsheet with all the students in it. And, there are columns for every assignment. And, I mark in the spreadsheet when they handed it in and if they handed it in and whatever. And now we have so many more. And I've got hundreds of different spreadsheets for every single cohort and running reports on like the progress on cohorts is impossible. Can you just build it into the app so the app now just has all the spreadsheets in one place? Like, no, I can't. Right. So that's sort of like the way I'd want, like I would bring them that problem and see what they do with it. I would love like to recreate that link problem at Twitter. I think Airbnb also is just amazing product and UX design, right? I'd want them to recreate that. One of the interview questions I would ask my product people was everybody books an Uber to the airport. How do you get them to book the Uber both from the airport to their destination and then from their destination eventually back to the airport and from the airport to their homes? I want to ensure that if you're taking an Uber to the airport, you book all those 4 trips. What do you do? Sometimes I would get answers like I put advertising in the Uber pickup about use Uber to book. There's 100 different solutions. The first question you have to ask is, well, why aren't people doing that? Is it laziness? They think they're going to find a different route. Do they have more flexible travel plans? So maybe they don't have the return flight booked. I want to understand that a lot. I'd want to understand, like, am I allowed to offer discounts for booking the airport to destination at the same time you're booking the airport trip? Am I allowed to send push notifications, a day into their trip that offers them a discount? Things like that. How would I possibly integrate with like their calendar or like ticking, like airline basically, to even know what is the end date, where are they going, things like that. So yeah, I'd want to understand that, and I'd come up with different solutions and then figure out like, yeah, what are we going to try first and how are we going to measure it?
You come up with like two really interesting ideas here that I think are like super important for engineering that just like maybe it is not looked at as much as it should be. The first is, like you mentioned, just like requirement deconstruction. Do we need this? Why do we need this? People just don't ask that question. Sometimes Avdi Grimm has this like fantastic talk. I forget what conference it was at, where it was like no code. And like often like the best solution is just not writing anything. Maybe just start with like a spreadsheet and see if like you can get away with that before like you're like, do you even need a database table, right? Like sometimes the processes just like don't require the complexity, and like that is not really taught. That's supposed to be like an on-job thing of, oh, you like discover the complexity and when you need it and don't. And then like after 5 years or so of developing stuff, you realize, oh, I didn't need to create 3 chains of abstractions to just like create a blog post. Maybe I could have just used a Git repo, right? And then let it do its thing, which some people do, right? And you can do now. But at the same time, the second thing is like this learn by example of, this is how I learned Rails really well, is like there used to be a site called Open Source Rails, and they had like a bunch of open source Rails apps for very specific purposes, like a bug tracking tool, right? Like a project management, like they had all the different things that you would use day to day in your software engineering skill set. And they had a Rails app, and you go and you look how they built the bug tracker. We almost need tools like that have this, like you mentioned, like an example set up, already done. And you ask an AI tool, how does this work?
That's an interesting point, right? Because all we are persisting right now is the end result, but not the means to get there. That's interesting.
Yeah, we actually had a code reading club at Flatiron where we do exactly that. I would, pick an open source project, and every week we would read the code and discuss it. And, in Saran, Yiprak started Code Newbies. One of the events they had weekly was she took a code reading club. It's amazing. Like the good job source code. There, by that site, Open Source Rails still exists. And there's a whole bunch of like awesome open source Rails, that GitHub repo. I think it's great. Like that is exactly how I approach, right? And again, like I would have essentially my AI tutor. It would know that code base, and they basically have like a chat session where the AI would like basically help prompt them about what part of this code you want to read first, and show the source, the GitHub lines like side by side where it can really walk through. I'd love them to be able to like mouse over a line on that code and see like a quick AI explanation, right? So that even that user experience is better than them having to open the code and navigate to it. I think it's such an amazing way to learn. The same way with like the product stuff. There are a lot of great websites that list, here are the amazing product solutions, right? Let's look at them. Let's understand why they're so coveted and amazing.
I think of the Rails guides, Chris Oliver contributing all these example apps.
Yeah,
right?
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
It's like so brilliant. Like that is ultimately, what a great use of the funds for, to be honest, from the foundation.
I know.
Like, that's ultimately what the guides needed this whole time. Now that you see it, right?
That's also like Agile Updo and Ruby on Rails is such a great book because that is how it approaches it, right? There's this entire narrative, it's totally different than like the Rails 3-way or Pooter. I don't know how many of the books in the Rails world are like that. And DHH in general is just so good at that. The 5-minute blog, same way of approaching, right? I think those were a lot of elements that I brought to teaching that made a big difference in like the outcome and also the experience of what it felt like to learn. That is how I approach it. They just can't use ChatGPT out of the box. They would rob themselves of learning. I built a sample of this tutor. It's actually a line called like SocraticTutor.ai or something. It doesn't give you an answer. Like you ask it what 1+1 is, and it will be like, well, what do you think 1+1 is? This really pedantic. And I would tell students also that when you ask me a question, I am just going to ask you one back. You're going to think I'm an ass and I'm just being pedantic and annoying, but like I will ask you some leading questions. Like I just won't give you answers. You'll discover the answer yourself. So I would very much build that sort of tutor, right? And give it different modes so that I would understand, like, are they building right now? Are they learning? Are they debugging? And constrain the way it's going to interact with them based on that.
I've seen some similar ones out there where they generate incorrect answers and inject bugs on purpose.
Oh, yeah.
For that same like learning.
Oh, I love that. That is so brilliant. Yeah. Oh my God. I love that. I love that. That's such a good idea. That is some good product thinking.
I think of like the Rails parameters, right? Like it's so easy to just have a params permit that just isn't including something. And then you submit the form and like, well, why isn't this saving this one field I have in my form? Yeah, I'll just drop that and let them find out what it is.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
All the curriculum at Flatiron was test driven. Every lesson was essentially a repo on GitHub. And, I would give them a test suite and everything would fail. And they would basically, you need to make it pass. And that was also one way in which I would give them the spec of what they needed to build. And to some extent, the architecture. Sometimes it would be like a Selenium suite so they could pick it themselves, but they know the elements that need to exist and the end result. But sometimes I'm literally giving them, describe this class and here are the instance methods. They're learning test-driven development. They're learning how to debug. They're not being scared by broken code. But yeah, I think it's a great idea. That is some awesome product thinking, right? Like have the AI inject bugs on purpose, script it.
Sometimes I do that to myself just to stop from generating AI slop. Is I'll generate a test that fails and then have it purposefully not work appropriately. I'm like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't be generating code today.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I'd give lectures and they were all so scripted, I would do something wrong on purpose and like the bug would come up. I'd be like, oh, that's weird. And then why do you guys think it's not working? Like, how should we debug it? What's their approach? It also showed students that like, it's okay to make mistakes. Literally all your code is broken by definition at first, and it's not your fault. When you get the code working, you're no longer programming. You're done for the day.
Right.
I did the same thing when I was teaching, but I did not have to plan it in advance. I was guaranteed to have at least 1 to 2 failures in front of the class every time.
That's how I came up with them.
Yeah.
It actually happened.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, this is now built into this lecture.
We're coming up on time. So should we get to our final segment?
Yeah, I think so. We didn't get to dive into all of your philosophical thinking about creativity and how the muse plays into all this AI stuff. You have a lot of great points on many articles that I thought were pretty insightful. If you're interested in that, folks, I would recommend checking out Avi's articles. He's got some great stuff. And I don't think, we're going anywhere as engineers anytime soon.
More software, it's counterintuitive, but more software has only created the demand for more engineers. And we're going to get so much more software in this world now. And the demand for engineers is just going to skyrocket. Again, I think what entry level looks like is going to change. But I remember like early on in my career with like the WYSIWYG error of like Dreamweaver and Flash. And people were like, you don't need that. Like, just everyone's going to do this, And I was like, nah, that's not going to happen, And then when like the low code tools came out, like Retool and stuff, we're not going to need more programmers. Every person is going to be able to build their own, app. And I was like, nope, Now, like, yeah, the vibe coding thing, like people that are vibe coding stuff and like the app gen is what I call like lovable bolts. Man, those things are not even close to approaching the complexity of the stuff we work on. It's just not.
Although, to your mention of Flash, creativity has truly dropped off since, I feel like. It used to be so easy to animate stuff and like frame by frame. Personally, I felt a huge loss there.
Yeah, and those things are really necessary, right? All that.
Absolutely
crap,
necessary. We're getting up on time. I wanted to make sure that we hit this. We started this new segment at the end of the show where we share an AI prompt or tool that we're using that we found very useful. Super helpful if it's day to day, but could be anything where you're just like, wow, when I found this,
The thing I've been really interested in right now is this thing that Kirian and the Every team call compounding engineering, which is what is the automated workflow look like so that when you're starting something, it creates the GitHub issue. And it can read from that and then create whatever your spec is, right? The markdown files or whatever that you can review. And then it can create the solution and put in the PR. And then you have another agent being able to review that PR and leave comments and give you a summary of what the refactor should be. And based on all of that, at every step, you're basically changing your prompts so that when you're reviewing, here are the things I want you to pay attention to. Here are the things not to do. And then you're basically constantly on this end-to-end cycle, automating smaller parts and giving each part the ability to reinforce and learn over time so that it doesn't make the same mistake. The amount of times when I've had it write a spec where it estimates in human time, this sprint will take 1 to 2 weeks. Right? What do you mean, man? You're going to get it all done today. The amount of time that it writes tests for performance, like these weird edge cases, like, okay, let me make sure that this can get called 100,000 times. Like, what are you doing? Don't write performance tests. Here's how to constrain the edge cases that you're writing. I haven't gotten that full workflow yet. Actually, next week, me and Nate and Kieran are having like a Zoom call where Kieran's going to break it down for us because Nate doesn't understand how that even works. And I haven't gotten it like, I just want it because I work on a small team and alone a lot. I don't know if I need that end-to-end stuff, but I think that's a really interesting thing. And again, that's what I mean about workflow. Understanding how to have the AI consistently learn from its mistakes and codify that into the process so you don't have to constantly hit them. At first, we were using like cursor rules and things like that. That doesn't work because the AI just doesn't, it can't get the context, as much as I try to be like, you have an active record agent, here's how he's an expert. If I forget to tell it to use that agent, it won't. And then I just have the general AI writing complex active record stuff. And it makes the same kind of crap that if it read that agent file and my rules for how to, use AR, like active record, it wouldn't have done that. So that solution, I think, is still very much needed, right? How do you prevent the AI in every part of your workflow from making the same mistakes over and over?
Can you send us a link maybe to the compounding engineering?
Yeah, he's written a few articles about it. Yeah, like I am in awe of how they build in their workflows.
Yeah, we'll add it to the show notes. As for me, so what's been making the rounds at Def Method over the last week is Peter Steinberger's Just Talk to It, the no BS way of agentic engineering. And I'll add this to the chat here. So this is like long form, experiences with the different models, like what we were talking about. It is all workflow and it's really been excellent. I've started implementing some of the things that he talks about there. It seems like a very seasoned experience report. Made me want to get Peter on the show. Maybe we'll reach out.
I think workflow is very much taken for granted. And I think it's like, you have to focus on it, right? Like you have to make that investment. And I think also it'd be really cool to do studies of prompts. I think it's a really cool thing. Like I would love to see more people publish the prompts they used and like the even chats. And I would read those a lot. I think that'd be so interesting.
I do too. And I think to your point, it could be that across the industry, workflow is being taken for granted or not being discussed enough. But on this show, every single person who comes on is talking about workflow. And we get, of course, very smart, very driven, very successful engineers on this show. So I think that is providing an example for all of our listeners, for sure, certainly for me. V, how about you?
I just listened to a Latent Space podcast episode where they had Lance Martin on, who does the Open Deep Research Project. And he gave this, it was a really great talk on breaking down agentic structures and communication layers and what works and doesn't. He's tried all kinds of different things. One thing really stood out, and it was this project he made called LLMs Text Architect. And LLMs.txt is like a emerging standard for communicating website contents to LLMs. And what he found just trying to generate a ton of content and consuming it for agents is that often if you just like give it a ton of information, it doesn't use it very well. And so what this does is kind of just break it down into like simple, really workable descriptions with URLs that link to the content. And he's found that performance-wise, these agents that consume these LLM text files, they perform much better if you just give it those descriptions and then have them go consume it on their own than if you try and generate a full stack that ingests the data yourself. And it's really wild. And so he has like kind of a script that lets you generate that from like a documentation website or something like that, and just like makes it really easy to do. So I've been playing with that. It's really fun. And then he also has some great insight into kind of like learnings from the bitter lesson on how to set up structure for your AI related workflows or services in a way that allows you to easily remove that structure. Because what is learned over time is that the models get better at specific things. And if you kind of like code yourself into a certain structure, it could kind of force yourself to get worse over time because the models get better in different ways. And so it's really interesting insight.
This is with successive releases of the model, or, well, I'll check it out. I'll listen to the episode.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
I want to thank our guest, Avi, for joining us today. Avi, where can we find you, find your work?
I'm very active on X. So, my username is Avi Flombaum. My blog is code.avi.nyc. I haven't published anything in a little bit, but X is a great way. I love it. I love the Ruby community and just the engineering community on X. I think it's great. Like, I love my feed. People complain about their feeds a lot, and I love mine. Like, I just hit not interested in all the crap.
All right.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining us. The Manning Early Access of The Well-Grounded Rubyist Edition 4 is out, and there'll be a link for you in the show notes. Come and get 50% off and check it out. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And everybody have a great day. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you guys so much.